Hi everybody, my name is Dr. Jimmy Packham. I'm a lecturer at the University of Birmingham in the English department where I specialise in North American literature, in 19th century writing, and in Gothic literature, which is what I'd like to talk to you today about. But what I think unites the sort of wide range of topics that I'm interested in, that I research on, that I write about, is an interest in the ways in which literature seeks to engage us at an ethical level. I don't mean to say by that that it spends its time dictating certain morals to us, that it tells us how we should behave. Instead, I want to suggest that by taking the challenges, the literature we read, seriously, that this gives us a more nuanced understanding of the ideological and the socio-political structures that underpin the worlds we exist in. It enables us not just to rethink those structures and those ideologies, but to rethink who we are and who we might be. It challenges us to get to grips with the limits of our own worldview. Studying literature isn't going to make you a better person, but it might make you more receptive to strangeness or otherness or difference, and more importantly than that, I think, more receptive to thinking in detail about difficult scenarios, difficult ideas that challenge some of our core values. It suggests we ought not to be complacent. And so what I want to talk to you today about is one of the ways I think Gothic fiction can do this, by thinking in particular about the role of food, or what we might think of more explicitly as the politics of consumption in Gothic fiction. I hope some of the examples that I mention today will be familiar to you, even if only by name. But I also hope some of the examples are less familiar, maybe slightly more unusual. But before we get started, I think there are already two questions that I think we need to address. And they are these. What is the value of Gothic literature? Why should we bother reading it? And second, is there really that much to say about food in Gothic writing? Isn't that a bit niche? So let's address this first one first. Gothic literature, as I'm sure most of you know, is the literature of horror, the literature of terror, of haunted castles, crumbling mansions, and the deranged goings-on inside them. The Gothic is not really interested in telling us about good behaviour, but about transgressive behaviours. Gothic literature is valuable for testing the limits of our own worldview. It pushes at boundaries, at our boundaries. It sets out to shock us. This may be as true today as it was when the genre first emerged in the late 18th century in 1764. But none of this precludes the possibility that the Gothic is also a genre that urges its readers to think deeply and meaningfully about the value of its horrors, about what we might learn from an encounter with its strange spectacles. Gothic presents us with that which we or society won't countenance, in order to stimulate us into thinking what we will countenance, to urge us to confront our own limits as to what is morally or socially or culturally acceptable. The Gothic flouts those limits in order either to re-establish them or leave them permanently destabilised as we reconsider the foundations on which our worldview, our way of engaging with others is predicated. For example, everybody knows that a vampire cannot do anything to you until you have invited it into your home. What's crucial here is not the vampire, but the question confronting you. Will you let a stranger into your home? To encounter the Gothic like this is to be asked to entertain taking a leap of faith. And so what about that second question? What about food? You may wish to take a moment just to reflect on any books you've read lately in which food features. How does it feature? Does it seem integral to the plot or even to the meaning or interpretation of the text? This might seem quite inconsequential, but think how significant food is, not just to our day-to-day lives, but as a marker, as an index of cultures.
for which kinds of food are so often a shorthand. And perhaps more importantly, how important they are in the history of encounters between cultures. There's a darker side to this too, the idea that we judge the moral merits of our own culture by the seemingly strange or simply wrong foods, wrong ways of eating practiced by others, by other cultures or nations. So of course it makes sense to pay attention to this within literature. A really great example of this in the Gothic, and worth following up on later if you're interested in this, appears on the very first page of chapter 1 of Bram Stoker's famous novel, Dracula. This leads us, quite neatly, into the Gothic, which is where my research on this topic has focused. Let's think for a moment about some of the most famous monsters that come to us from the pages of Gothic fiction. Frankenstein's monster, Dracula, vampires, zombies shuffling into view. Here's something else worth discussing in more detail later. What is it that makes these things so villainous, so monstrous? On the one hand, surely, it's the threat that they pose to social order, to civilization itself. But on the other, it is the manner in which they do this. They are objects of horror fundamentally because of what they eat, because they eat the wrong things, because, above all, they wish to eat us. The Gothic is in large part a genre in which things are continually being eaten. It's a genre obsessed with consumption and with incorporation, the horror of being incorporated into the monstrous bodies that threaten us, with the horror of being seen as a kind of ready meal. Given how attuned we are these days to our own diets, and the fact that we are continually being presented with information or adverts and so on around what we should and should not be eating, it's perhaps not especially surprising that since around the turn of the century, a lot of Gothic fiction has been overtly preoccupied with food and eating habits. In particular, it's interested in discussing vegetarianism. Since 2000, for example, we have seen this in the relatively popular novel Under the Skin by Michel Faber, and more recently in the absolutely masterful South Korean novel The Vegetarian. This perhaps has emerged as a result of several overlapping contemporary concerns: our increasingly politicised interest in how we treat the planet and the other creatures that inhabit it with us, the animals on whom we rely so heavily in many ways, and also relatedly, but closer to home, concerns about what we are putting into our own bodies, how we are treating ourselves. And where this genre, where vegetarian horror may differ from the vampire genre, say, is in its figuration not of monstrously other practitioners of transgressive eating, but of the everyday eating practices of large swathes of humanity as a site of Gothic unease. But it's a mistake, I think, to assume that this is a new interest for the Gothic. Let's turn back to perhaps the most famous Gothic story of all, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. One of the questions you might want to ask yourself for a moment here is, what qualities do you associate with Frankenstein's monster, or Frankenstein's creature? Okay, so questions about what we might eat and why and what this says about us, and thinking specifically about vegetarianism, are writ large in this book. Partway through the novel, the creature confronts the man who made him, Victor Frankenstein, and asks him to create a mate, a partner, with whom he will hide away and cease his reign of terror. During this conversation, the creature mentions his diet, and he says this: "My food is not that of man. I do not destroy the lamb and the kid to glut my appetite. Acorns and berries afford me sufficient nourishment." The creature tells us here of his vegetarian or perhaps even his vegan credentials. This is something we perhaps miss in contemporary reworkings of this story. Very rarely do we see a creature chowing down on a bowl of lentils. But the insistence here between conventional human appetites and the necessity of violence and destruction to appease those appetites is unequivocal. Where the creature's vegetarian diet is presented as moderate and humane and nourishing, humanity's own carnivorousness is seen as somehow enthralled to its own excessive cravings. This remark serves to establish a more benevolent ethical engagement with the world and its non-human inhabitants. The creature he articulates what critics like Carol J. Adams have called an inclusive moral code. An inclusivity that incorporates the non-human animal, an emblem, says Adams, of what the creature hoped for and needed but failed to receive from human society. Something you might discuss with others after this session is this. How does thinking about the creature as vegetarian change how we understand him and his meaning in the book? How might you reconcile this statement of his, say, with his later violent actions in the novel? Let's turn briefly now to a more contemporary vegetarian Gothic story to consider this in a bit more detail. I want to talk here about Han Kang's short novel, The Vegetarian. What makes this book so compelling is that it doesn't simply present a simple tale of vegetarianism is better or right or more ethical. It's much more troubling than that, more nuanced, more ambivalent towards its subject matter. This book doesn't give us any easy answers. Instead, it asks us to do the hard work, to work towards understanding the ethical underpinnings with which this book is also wrangling. The Vegetarian tells the story of a woman called Yong Hai, whose turn to vegetarianism early on in the novel isolates her from her traditional South Korean family. Rapidly, she begins to opt out of almost every single kind of consumption, until, in the novel's final sequence, she is institutionalized and hardly living at all, trying to live off water and sunlight alone, as she seeks to transform herself into a tree. Yong Hai's vegetarianism here is at odds with the culture she lives in, and this is evident from the novel's opening line. Her husband says, "Before my wife turned vegetarian, I'd always thought of her as completely unremarkable in every way." One of the things I think this book is interested in is what we might term ecological immanence. It's a term worth keeping a note of. It means to have an awareness of how humanity is bound up in wider networks of the natural world, to understand humanity not simply as aloof or separate from these networks. It's an idea explored in detail by people like the eco-critic Mary Mellor in her book Feminism and Ecology. Throughout The Vegetarian, we get glimpses of this sort of ecological immanence. We get glimpses of Yong Hai's thought processes as she finds herself upset by the idea of eating meat. She talks about it as that vivid, strange, horribly uncanny feeling. As she prepares meat, she experiences hazy distinctions, boundaries wearing thin, familiarity bleeds into strangeness, certainty becomes impossible. She says, "I become a different person rises up inside me, devours me." The novel suggests there is a dismantling of subjectivity in the consumption of meat. There are hazy distinctions and boundaries wearing thin. The processing of the animal for meat has generated a dissolution of the subjectivity of the meat eater. It changes who she feels she is. So The Vegetarian, I think, can be approached as a novel explicitly about the blurring of boundaries, the difficulties of navigating between modes of being and socially sanctioned behaviours, and the different ways one can incorporate or be incorporated into the more than human world beyond us. In the end, Yong Hai's efforts are doomed. Her only escape from a world in which she seemingly cannot do anything that isn't in some way inflected by violence or oppressive actions is to opt out of it. And this, perhaps, isn't a success, but a tragedy. As a Gothic story, The Vegetarian reminds us that acts of consumption, that what we eat, is always going to be a political act, or an act with political overtones. It reminds us of the difficulty of acting truly benevolently in a world we share with animals, with nature, with the non-human. I'd like to wrap this session up by showing you how this kind of reading and analysis translates out into the real world. You may remember at the beginning of this year that there was a conspiracy theory circulating online that said the current pandemic began because people in China were eating bat soup. This theory, I think, implicitly stresses the apparent horror invested by certain humans in other creatures and other cultures, and the cultural contingency of notions of proper ways to encounter or consume the animal.
So, As you find yourself continuing to think about the ideas I've raised in this session, think about how your skill as readers of literature can translate into readers of these kinds of narratives of unsettling or disturbing cultural encounters. Seek to have discussions about how food appears in the literature you read, but also about how this might help you speak about attitudes and understandings and anxieties towards food in the cultures we all live in and share. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, I'm Brennig, and today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about studying English at university, what kind of modules you might get to study, what kind of timetable you might be likely to follow, as well as a few top tips about how to do well in the course. A little bit about me to begin with. Hi, I'm Brennig, and I'm a third year English student at Mansfield College in Oxford. Before that, I was a pupil at Ysgol Gymraeg Bro Morgannwg in Barry, in the Vale of Glamorgan, where I studied A-levels in English literature, Welsh and French. And I was also a former member of the Sarah network, like you guys are now. So why I chose to study English at university? For me, studying English was kind of a logical choice just because it was my favourite subject pretty much throughout school from year 7 onwards, I'd say. I just always really loved reading and writing and just thinking about literature generally, so the thought of doing that for 3 years did seem very, very appealing to me. I also like the fact that with an English degree it gives you a really good opportunity to develop communication skills, so forming new ideas and having the ability to express them quite fluently and eloquently, which I think is obviously a really important skill to develop in the workplace, but also just in life in general. And yeah, like I said, just the thought of spending 3 years reading and discovering new literature when I was applying in sixth form, that just seemed like a really exciting thing to me to do. And coming to the end of that 3 years, I think it really has lived up to my hopes and expectations of it. So if that is also something that you might be interested in pursuing, then I definitely would recommend studying English. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about some examples of modules you might end up studying as an English student, which is largely based off my own experience of what I've studied, but I think holds true of quite a few English courses in other unis as well. So the first one here is early medieval literature, so that's Old English, which, if I'm honest, I did not expect to enjoy when we studied that in first year. When I was in sixth form, I largely only read 20th century and 21st century writing, so the thought of going back in time to the 7th century and trying to tackle Beowulf in the original Anglo-Saxon definitely instilled quite a bit of fear in me. But while it was a challenge, it was actually one that I really enjoyed and kind of relished much more than I thought I would. So much so that in the second year I actually did decide to almost specialise in medieval literature, which, if you told me that at 17, I absolutely would not have believed you, I wouldn't think. So I guess that just goes to show that it's important to go into it with an open mind, because you never know what you might discover and end up really enjoying. We also studied Victorian literature, so that was some of the kind of big names of English literature like Henry James, Oscar Wilde, Charles Dickens, George Eliot. And then modern literature, so Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, as well as more contemporary writers like Zadie Smith or Ali Smith. Obviously, it might be difficult to get through an English degree without touching on Shakespeare, but the work we've done on Shakespeare I've actually really enjoyed. We did King Lear at A-level, but actually engaging with other Shakespeare texts and considering that in a broader context has been really useful and kind of illuminating, and I've enjoyed that a lot. And then this year I've been studying a paper called The American Renaissance, which is 19th century American literature. So like Moby Dick, as the lovely picture of the whale on the slide attests to. And that's been good because it's been a way of gaining perspective on literature outside of Britain and the UK. And then for my dissertation, I've been working on Dylan Thomas and Welsh writing in English, which has been nice to be able to incorporate my own personal interests and bring in some of that Welshness into my English degree in that way. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about a kind of typical timetable for an English student at university. And an important aspect of that is that English is really mostly independent study, so it's quite different from STEM subjects, for example, which get lots of contact hours. English is, as you would expect, a lot of reading and essay writing and a lot of time spent in the library. So I think it is important to be aware of that and to be kind of disciplined and focused in that way. But it's not to say that you don't get contact hours, because you do. I would probably expect to have maybe one tutorial a week, which is just a kind of a face-to-face meeting with a tutor, giving feedback on the essay that I'd submitted that week, as well as usually one class or seminar a week where you come together as a group and discuss some of the readings from that week, and perhaps also give a brief presentation on some of the ideas that have cropped up. But it's not too intense, luckily. And then obviously there's also lectures that you can attend in the faculty, and just in Oxford there aren't that many compulsory lectures, so you can largely choose how many you want to attend, but your tutors will advise you, depending on what uni you go to, how many or which ones they would like you to attend. But the lectures can be really useful and insightful in terms of sparking ideas and offering reading suggestions, so I definitely would recommend attending as many as possible, at least to begin with. So now moving on to what I enjoy most about studying English. And the first thing would probably be the range of the course, which I hope I've given you a kind of a taste of a few slides ago. Just the fact that you pretty much can study everything from Beowulf to Virginia Woolf and then beyond that again. There's such breadth and scope and potential to look at so many different time periods and authors and literary movements. It's really exciting in that sense, and I feel like you come away with a really comprehensive view of literature and a real understanding of it, which obviously you would hope to receive studying it at degree level. I also really like the chance to be original and try new things. So I don't know how you guys feel, but I know when I was studying A level, I felt almost quite restricted by the curriculum. Obviously there's certain criteria and assessment objectives that you have to meet and certain points you have to make to get the marks, but at university level you can be much more, like I say, original and free thinking, and kind of suggest new ideas and experiment in that way, and tutors really welcome that kind of fresh approach, which I really appreciate. And then also I really like the fact that studying English you do develop a real ability to read and think critically, which is, I would say, so important, especially in this day and age when there's so much misinformation being spread around. It's good to be able to read an article and be able to kind of analyse it and work out what it's really trying to say. Just briefly, how to do well in the course. I've kind of covered a few of these things already, but one thing would be the importance of being self-motivated, of setting little mini deadlines for yourself in order to get the work done, because it is mostly independent study. Also, it's important to do the reading because it is probably much harder to write a 2,000 word essay in a book you haven't read, believe it or not. And I would say, try and think outside the box and come with your own unique approach. And as long as you argue it well and justify it, then I think tutors tend to be quite impressed by that kind of originality of thought. And finally, here are just some potential career types that English graduates go into after finishing their studies. So things like journalism, teaching, working for the government. And as you can see, there's a real range here, which shows that as an English student or an English graduate, you are quite free to determine your own path and choose what you want to do afterwards, which is always good. And finally, thank you very much for listening. And if you do choose to apply to study English at university, then good luck.
Gobeithio chi fwynhau. I do hope you enjoyed your first masterclass full of interesting ideas. Egwyl fach nawr, let's have a short 5-minute break from the screen. Stretch your legs, take a comfort break, ac yna dod nôl i'r lobby. Come back to the lobby for your next masterclass. A fydd yn dechrau, which will start at 2:55.